Hi, great. Well, thank you very much indeed for our presenters for bringing together their thoughts and recording them for us. We're incredibly grateful to you for doing that. Perhaps if the presenters might like to turn their cameras back on again now, and we can get into the Q&A. Just to remind people, these are recorded, so if you'd like to re-watch any of the presentations, they'll be there available to do that. I wonder if we have some questions coming in. We have a question from Gabriela Moreno, Doreen Stavinsky have put some questions in. Please do feel free to add questions that you're interested in. Before we go to those, I just wanted to ask a quick question of clarification, really for my own purposes, to Nathalie. You were talking about forestation and the effects of monoculture, and we know that they all have effects in terms of nitrous oxide releases and methane releases, and there are questions about downstream permanence and how we manage that. But you mentioned that afforestation could affect peatlands, and I just wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that. Are you saying that the afforestation will affect peatlands if they're adjacent to a distance, or were you meaning if they were planted in peatlands themselves?
Thank you for the question. This is a very, it's a very important one. Both in answer to it. Obviously, throughout the world, we see examples and ongoing examples of where conifer or other species have been planted on peats, on various different sorts of peat bogs. This is something that's happened locally in Scotland and is continuing to happen both there and in Ireland, but also there are concerns that if the plantations are close to the peat bogs, they also compromise the integrity and health of the peat bogs, largely because afforestation, especially monoculture afforestation with non-natives, tends to be quite influence the water flows and soil moisture content and takes water out of the system away from the peat bog. So even if they're nearby, they can be harmful as well. And this is a huge problem because obviously peat is a very important part of the climate change mitigation story. So I think that's a very important one to flag, especially from a UK perspective, but then also looking in other parts of the world, in New Zealand and Canada as well. This is also an issue.
No, that's super. Particularly with permafrost melting becomes more problem. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to turn straight to the questions from the audience now. I'm not going to pick on anyone to answer a particular question. So it'd be great if you could just choose the question that you want to ask. Actually, let's try and get everyone to have a go at every question. That'll be good. So Gabriel Morello has asked, do you think that we could incorporate climate as a common good into the global economy to speed up nature-based solutions adoption worldwide?
I can come in if the two colleagues can. The point is that actually what we have tried to articulate is that nature-based solutions is part of the climate change solutions. There is no one single bullet. And it's what has been the emphasis of all the speakers is that there is unavoidable the mitigation, the drastic reduction of emissions. And then in doing so, there is a number of other solutions, such as nature-based solutions that can provide some element. And then as it has been indicated, it acts like a sponge. And then at a certain level, the sponge can take part of the carbon, and then but certain stage it cannot go beyond the capacity it can take. Certain things can be done with nature-based solution. It is not a bullet silver for the climate issues.
Okay, thank you. Youba, could I just ask you to turn your camera on, by the way? We can hear you very well, but we couldn't see you for that.
My camera is on.
Oh, you're here now? That's fine.
My camera is on. I don't know what happened.
Okay, well, you're here now as well. It's good to see you again.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, Holly, did you have any views on this?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could. The question is, how do we go about it? Is a carbon price sufficient for incorporating climate into the global economy? I think this links also to the next question about offsetting. So if you want to incorporate climate, there's a commodification process where you need to be able to identify some unit of carbon in a particular place. And I think we're running into some challenges there that I'm sure we'll talk about shortly.
Thanks. Nathalie, did you want to add anything before?
Sort of unless we have systemic change in the way we run our economies in general, unless we adopt a biocircular economy model, and then it'll be very hard to scale up nature-based solutions. We need shifts in patterns of consumption and diet to enable us to have enough land to do this restoration and so forth. And I think that speaks to the need to replace GDP or at least improve, so that we've got other, so impacts on the biosphere and the climate are taken into account, and the nature of the value of nature, both that which is measurable and that which is not, is taken into account with all the decision making we do. And that's like that higher level thing, because otherwise, again, it's just, it's going to be very difficult to take things to scale so long as we value our economies by how much consumption we do, and that is the cause of the problems we face. So yeah, it's a high level answer, but I think it's important not to forget that when we talk about this topic. So thanks for the question, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Dorian Stabinsky's question, which is for all of you. So whoever wants to go first, I'll read it out just so everybody can hear what it is. So a question for all panelists. There's a limited carbon budget left with objectively no room for offsetting. So we must decarbonize and remove. So why the continued emphasis on offsetting, and why keep talking about carbon credits?
I think what I'd like to say is that, as it's important that we don't fund the restoration of ecosystem through offsetting without verifying that those who are providing the investments via that route have very ambitious, very credible decarbonisation plans. And I would go a step further in saying also a credible and ambitious plan to remove ecosystem loss and damage from their supply chains. It's not possible for all businesses to do that immediately, or all sectors to do that immediately. And some are making great efforts to really bend that curve on there and basically plan around and finance those ambitious plans, but many aren't as well. And so it's more like it's valuable to talk about improving metrics to measure both carbon and biodiversity, the biodiversity premiums with them at this time where there is all this potential finance that could be quickly put to good use, so long as it's not being used in greenwashing. So I think it's a sort of a temporary thing while we get to net zero carbon and net zero biodiversity loss. Hopefully that answers the question, but I'm sure my colleagues will have other perspectives on that one.
Yeah, I could add in something here. I think that right now this is highly confusing because we're using the same language to talk about a few different things. So a few months ago, there came out this document, the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting. And it talks about, most offsets available right now are emission reductions, which are necessary but not sufficient to achieve net zero. And they call for a shift to carbon removal offsetting, which would be some of the things we've talked about today. And right now it's pretty fuzzy. We're using kind of the same terms to talk about these different things. So people have called for this clear separation of emissions reductions and carbon removals. But I don't think we've evolved the language or the frameworks to really distinguish quite yet.
Well, just what I want to add on that is an important issue, and that need to be looked at carefully at the global context rather than in isolation on a small scale. And then many companies and many business sector, industrial sector also are looking seriously at that question, and then to avoid any potential, offsetting, because we need to bring that at the global context. And then in so doing, it's one of the elements that needs some guidance, and then that also is part of the governance process of the nature-based solution.
Okay, thank you very much, all three of you. I'm going to move on to Marion Palmer's question now. How do we agree and harmonize metrics that validate claims of biodiversity in nature-based solutions projects? I'm going to ask Nathalie to answer that as a professor of biodiversity, I think.
So I was also answering another question at the same time.
Yes, sure,
I have to unfortunately hop off very quickly to collect my children from school. But yeah, no, really important question. And getting the biodiversity piece right is very, very important. And there's a huge amount of work in this going on in this area at the moment by all sorts of different collaborations between governments and biodiversity scientists to try and improve the metrics by which we measure biodiversity, so that they include, you know, a range of different you know, types of biodiversity from across different trophic levels, but you know, within the soil as well as above ground levels of biodiversity, and going beyond just looking at species richness, so numbers of species within different groups, and looking at, you know, functional diversity as an index of ecosystem health. So there is great work on that. There's been some brilliant papers, recent flurry of amazing papers towards the end of this year, looking at the concordance of biodiversity and carbon, and how much of the, you know, of the mitigation potential nature-based solutions can be realized by prioritizing protection and restoration of areas that are also very important for biodiversity. So some great work out in Nature and Science Advances on that recently. So there's obviously a real sort of urgency around getting this right, obviously, to make sure that the finance for carbon finance is going towards sustainable long-term carbon supplies, which are those that are underpinned by very species-rich and functionally diverse ecosystems.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. One thing we're talking about language and naming and terms. Another word that we keep using is the word "we." It'd be really interesting when you're answering the questions if you could say who you think these "we" people are as well. When we talk about "we should" and "we will" and "we must," who are these people, and how do they come together? It'd be really interesting to hear your views on that. But I'm going to go straight on to Franco Scrovin's the next question, so we can try and address the participants' questions rather than mine. So how to stop big companies like Shell from abusing the MBS idea, it's going to greenwash, and promoting compensation for forestation projects, which to distract from their unwillingness to reduce emissions or to take other measures. So sort of what governance measures are available or might we choose to develop to try and address this problem? And is it a problem? Is this happening? I'm going to ask Holly to start. Yeah.
Well, I didn't actually think about governance measures first when I read this question. I was thinking about both investor and citizen, you know, civic accountability. So I think that we do have an idea of what kind of the best standards of metrics are, as we've talked about. And so it's a matter of holding these companies accountable to these standards of the removals that are going to have, you know, social and sustainability safeguards with them. And so it requires the transparency to be able to track exactly where these afforestation projects are, what's going on the ground there, and then link that back and, you know, demand that these projects comply with better standards. And so I think that civil society has a huge load here in doing that kind of monitoring and accountability. And I hope that you know, philanthropists and others that fund civil society organizations can think about that important work.
I think in addition to civil societies, also local communities, those are surrounding the area, they have some role to play. And then if they are empowered and then supported, and then to do that. And to ask the question of we is you, me, all of us. It's countries and the states, government, because the climate is an issue we all have to deal with. It is not only part of the society that can deal with it. It's the states, it's communities, it's individual people, it's companies, and then we, all of us, we have to be engaged.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the questions and realise Shell are coming in for some stick, and we should reflect that other fossil fuel companies are available, and they are doing similar activities. So we shouldn't just focus on the one company. But so next question. Perhaps Nathalie, you might want to answer this first because I know you have to go very shortly. The question from Mike Bonaventure, building on your point on GDP, to what extent is the IUCN work on MBS linked across the developments in economics and philosophy and issues around contributive justice, distributive justice, and so on?
Well, I know that the standards are very comprehensive, and it was a 2-year consultation process in which they drew together expertise from, from practice, from academia, from government and business, and including, lots of, great thinkers that are very much aware of the fact that we need to get towards this biocircular economy. So it's definitely in there, but yeah, I wouldn't. Beyond that, I wouldn't know how to comment. But I think clearly, regenerating our agricultural systems, working with our carefully managing our working lands, protecting ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, all those key broad types of nature-based interventions are all enabled by a circular economy, and all participation of communities in those activities fosters this greater respect for the natural world and builds social capital and therefore resilience to future climate shocks. So it's definitely all linked, it's definitely part of it. There's discussions around how, can we stretch the concept of nature-based solutions to how can nature-based solutions sort of enable this transformation in how we perceive our relationship with nature and our patterns of consumption. I'm not sure we're there yet with the underlying evidence base, but I know that there's so much work and interesting information coming from the communities about the power, the empowerment that has come through implementing nature-based solutions, not just implementing but designing them and drawing on their own knowledge, and how often we've had this, not just scaling up of nature-based solutions but scaling out. And so I think the concept is definitely moving in that direction, and the standards process is definitely rooted in that, but it remains to be seen, as I say, how well that works out in the short term. We'll see. I mean, it's the standards will be revised through, they are dynamic, and after implementation, the way the whole thing's going to be operationalized, going to be opportunities for those from different sectors engaging with nature-based solutions to feed back to the scientific committee of, that underpins the standards development to improve them over time. So it's not like this is a standard and it's fixed. It's more like, let's see how these work and let's see whether or not we can improve them so that they better enable that systemic change that we need. I hope that vaguely answered the question. I'm going to have to step out of the conversation now, but thank you very much for this opportunity today, and I'll hopefully be able to answer some of the extra questions at a future date. Thank you.
That'd be super. Thank you very much, and thanks for the contribution. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Hi. Holly and Youba, did you want to say anything more on that, or would you like to move on? No.
I think that has been extensively covered by Nathalie.
Okay, super. That's great. So the next question we have is a slightly broader question, but we should address it. What is your opinion about tackling climate change through the lens or with the thinking around the planetary boundaries approach, or this finding a safe space for humanity to operate within on Earth? Do you think that's a useful approach? And if so, or if not, could you say why?
One thing I like about it is that it broadens the issues beyond climate change and just focusing on carbon all the time to, everything from nitrogen cycles to, it's a way of talking about this broader ecological crisis. So I think that that's useful, because I could imagine one world that manages to, manage carbon flows in a particular way, but is still suffering from other types of ecological crises. So.
I think it's an important element to consider, but it is not the only one. And then we also have to consider the social dimension, and then the equity dimension, and then the justice dimension. All are as important as ecological dimension. And then to have a sense of what at the global level, at the planetary level, can be done, and then what are the potential threats, is as important as on the social front, and then as the on the equity dimension, because different people, different around the world are not affected at the same level with the same intensity, and then the coping also potential possibility is not the same for different people, even including the same country.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to flag that Doreen's put a post in giving us some more information about Shell in relation to my comments. So it'd be interesting for the participants and colleagues to have a look at that to learn more about it. I just wanted to touch on one more thing that's not come through in the questions, but we have 5-10 minutes left. That's the question of trade-offs. We've talked about the idea of having markets for this, but there are markets for many things. And if we were to start to use nature-based approaches, for example, forestation or restoring wetlands, trade-off decisions will have to be made in terms of land use and access to food and food security. And on occasion, there are incentives perhaps to deliver a nature-based approach such as forestation, but there are also incentives to do other things, and these compete. Have you any thoughts about how we might start to negotiate those trade-offs and how the governance conversation might evolve around that space?
Because I think that if I can come first, as I have limited expertise on nature-based solution, but I think that at the small scale, it would not work. If we think about nature-based solution, it's a larger scale. Thinking at the larger scale, the availability of land and other, it is not, they say, it's limited to go through. And then we have to think about some of the competition of using land, because land is used to produce food. Land is used to produce different other things. And there will be a competition between what land is used for and with those nature-based solutions. If some of the indication we set in the beginning, we did not think carefully about them, and then to see where it can be done, because you are not going to implement some of those solutions where there's no possibility, no option, and then for them to work, or it will be costly. And then all those need to be considered, if I can offer that as one of some element to.
Thank you. Hello, I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit about incentives. You talked in your presentation about Bellamy's notions of responsible incentivization. So how do you incentivize the uptake when trade-offs are involved?
I think it's hard to have a blanket approach to every technique. So take something like soil carbon sequestration. That can have benefits for farmers, but sometimes they may need new equipment. Sometimes they may need, education and a community of practice that can help them switch farming techniques. And so, I mean, simply having an app or a service that will pay them for certain practices isn't enough. There needs to be a social component too. So when I think about incentives, I think that there's a financial part of it that, in my view, I would like the state to help with this. But, some people talk about private companies as well having a role. And then there's the other stuff that supports the uptake of that incentive that we also need to be thinking about when we're designing these.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time now. I just wonder if either of you or both of you had a last few words you'd like to say, things you feel you need to get out, or reflections on what you've heard, or the questions and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's this question or idea about, fossil fuel companies as greenwashing when they approach nature-based solutions. But I think it's important to understand that they're just following the design of the framework that's laid out, because we didn't negotiate an agreement for the managed decline or phase out of fossil fuel production. We negotiated an agreement that focuses on emissions, which is the endpoint, and which says that we're going to have a balance of, emissions and then reductions to achieve that net zero. So there's some amount of continued emissions implied in that are going to be balanced by these removals. And so in a sense, they're kind of just going along with the language and the framework that the world has embraced. So if we want to move away from that, then we need to change the conversation to be about production or something else.
I think it is not the solution, it's part of the solution. And as the IPCC report on 1.5 indicated, we'll need a profound transformation on all aspects of the society. We are not only looking at nature-based solutions to solve the climate issues. We are not only looking at the carbon finance to look at the climate solution. We are not only looking at, various other responses, and then all of those need to be looked at in a holistic manner, and then for a longer term vision rather than in silos in isolation.
Okay, thank you very much. So very much the message is the conversation continues. The challenge is enormous and there's a long way to go and a lot of work to be done. But this is all part of the process. And we need to keep talking and thinking and reaching out to each other to learn more. So thank you for your contributions today. It's been tremendous. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. This is not an area I know much about at all. So we're going to come to a conclusion now, just to say that there are other activities going on, more Learn events, more Discuss events on C2G's website, and you'd be welcome to join us again. So with that, thank you very much. I wish you all a good weekend, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent.